IVM.
Hey everybody, welcome to another week on the IVM Podcast Network. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Paytm Money Upfront. Guys, we're heading into week 2 of the lockdown, and I'm sure it's been challenging for all of you, just as it's been for us. We're doing our best to make sure that we maintain our schedules, but beg your indulgence if we slip. In the meantime, if you're looking for more stuff to listen to, might I suggest you go dive into the archives. We've got over 6,000 episodes of content we've created over the last 5 years, and I'm sure there's something in there that you'd love listening to. Anyway, stay safe, and let me get you started with your show.
Hi and welcome to New York Kanoon. This is Amber from AM Nana Ventures, and today's topic for discussion in this series is about the Epidemic Diseases Act. In wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has covered the whole globe, it has caused a series of lockdowns around the world. How is India able to cope up with it? What is this act all about? Is it valid in today's time? The constitutional validity of the act, how it affects our lives. Let's just have a look at what this act particularly says. So the Epidemic Disease Act of 1897 was invoked on 24th of March by the Prime Minister. The idea of the act was basically to contain the movement of people and quarantine people in their homes. But many have questioned the validity of such an act because it was promulgated in 1897. And back then the concept of fundamental rights and directives, principles of state policies, etc., were all not relevant as we were governed by the British. So the law is pretty obscure. But let's just have a look at what the law is and why is it let's say a colonial era law. Basically, the legislation is a 2-page, 4-section document which defines neither what is a dangerous epidemic disease nor an epidemic. All right, it was basically enacted in 1897 as a response to the bubonic plague which had spread in Bombay, and then it spread across the country, which led to the death of thousands. So let's look at the sections. Section 2 of the law authorizes basically state governments to take exceptional measures and prescribe regulations that are to be observed to limit the spread of the disease. Section 3 of the Act makes it a criminal offence to disobey any regulation or order under this Act. This punishment is according to Section 188 of the IPC. The punishment is basically a fine of rupees 200 and a simple imprisonment of 1 month for violating an order of the public servant. The penalty of rupees 1,000 imprisonment of 6 months can also be imposed depending on the impact of the obedience. Section 4 of this act particularly gives protection under the law to officials or persons acting under the law. Now, what this means particularly is, in case if there is a police officer and he deems fit that you are not obeying the quarantine as per the act and as per the law and as per government's directives, he can take action against you, and you would not be able to register a complaint ab initio in the wake of the situation or at that moment, provided the officer can prove that he did this act particularly in the course or line of his duty, which itself in a way is very restrictive to your rights, because I understand that in 1897 we were not a free country, we were not independent, so such a law which is only one-sided and lopsided is perfect, but in the wake of, let's say, 21st century, the law does not stand the test of time of equality and rights. Said that, I'll also like to reiterate that such a law in a case where the greater good of the public is to be kept in mind is definitely required in case there is no other way to tackle the epidemic in India. Best ways, and I think we as citizens should cooperate with the same. But from a legal standpoint of view, it absolves all its authorities under the act from any formal action. So Section 4, I spoke about, gives protection under the law to officials or persons acting under the law. Section 2A, another important piece of act, empowers the central government to inspect ships or vessels leaving or arriving at any port in India and detain people if necessary. Now, this is the second fallacy which I wanted to bring forward in this episode. You see, back then, yes, ships or vessels were the only way through which international travel or commute between two distant places was effected. Now, in today's time, it does not talk about, airplanes, airports, and other means such as railways, buses, etc., etc. So the law falters at that end as well. It's not coping up with the times. So that's one of the other fallacies that is there. In fact, if many of you remember, it was this act was also implemented in 2009. I was well aware, and at that time present in Pune when it was invoked in the wake of the swine flu outbreak in 2009. It was also used to deal with dengue and malaria in Chandigarh in 2015. This also has been covered by the print in one of the daily publications which they use. Why do we call the law very, very pre-constitutional? I give you two incidences, but I'll not talk now. I'll talk about in detail. Let's look at, the lack of accountability in the law. I mean, what I meant to say again was we went through sections. The lack of accountability is there. The notification orders issued are just pure executive actions, which can be further delegated to junior executives with little or no accountability. What I meant to say by this was, in case if I'm a senior ranking officer, I tell a junior ranking officer, you need to do this and execute this, then that person is completely absolved from any liability at all in case the outcome is different than expected. So again, you see videos of cops beating innocent people on the street. Well, they are following orders which have been given to them. So no denial on that part. But where does the right of the citizen stand when this happens? Right. So this law hails from a time when we had no concept of fundamental rights. And there was no parliament. Hence, the restriction of the rights of the citizens is then and there implemented here. The fallacy which I would like to highlight for all of you out there is that the legislation is actually putting too much concentration on the fact regarding the duties of the government in preventing and controlling the epidemics, but it does not, nowhere talks about the rights of citizens, right? Also, it does not mention any scientific steps or any procedural steps that the government needs to take to contain or prevent the spread of disease. So it has been left at the helm of the state government to take those decisions. The biggest fallacy of this piece of legislation is specifically that it lacks a standard operating procedure. It lacks a standard framework that tells you that under what circumstances can states take away your rights, for how long, who will be the decision maker, who will be the authorities who will ensure that people have access to basic services, food, water, sanitational, requirements, personal entertainment, while their personal, when your freedom is being taken away. So it lacks all of that. Of course, the central government has been very proactive, and I would say the governments on their own have taken the initiatives, but the Act nowhere has laid down any of these guidelines that need to be followed in order to concretely form or be effective as an Act which is implemented. So it's actually leaving you open to the imagination of the government for it to take whatever steps it deems necessary instead of laying down a particular format. If you compare this with the National Disaster or the Disaster Management Act of 2005, it actually has, provisions for the government to allocate resources to prevent mitigation, also to assist different bodies in the state at the center level. But it does not in any way in comparison to the Epidemic Diseases Act, limit your rights. Rather, the Disaster Management Act actually of 2015 gives considerable freedom to the government to take decisions and spend money from the Disaster Relief Fund. And it also important fact to be seen here is that, the role of judiciary. What we are seeing here under the Epidemic Disease Act is the role of civil administration. So the rule of judiciary in this case under the Disaster Management Act is pretty clear. The district magistrates have wide power for requisition of resources in order to help out people. So I feel that we need a modern piece of legislation to combat this. Globally, if you look at, there are different pieces of legislation which have been invoked, which help people or which help the governments to deal with such a situation. I'm going to narrate some of those examples. In Australia, if we take an example, Section 51 of the Constitution provides the federal government with legislative powers, to quarantine. There is a law called the National Health Security Act, which is in lines with the international health regulations. What are these international health regulations? I'm again reiterating, India is definitely a signatory to the WHO, but this Epidemic Diseases Act in no way is in line with the international health regulations, which uphold the rights given under the Constitution, personal rights. I meant like rights under Article 14 to 21 of the Indian Constitution. They are not in line with the with the Epidemic Diseases Act at all. But certain laws like this, as I talk about, like Section 51 of the Constitution of Australia, it actually provides for the quarantine policy by keeping intact the fundamental rights of the citizens. So in United States, the Department of Health and Human Services, it is there to tackle such an epidemic. It has laid down guidelines to assist states during the health emergencies and prevent the spread of communicable diseases. In European Union, I think the EU decision document number /13 is the key legal instrument for threats to health. They are both in compliance with the international health regulations. The document 1082/13 requires signatory states to develop national plans for pandemic preparedness. Many actually countries have these plans in place, but India, as we speak again, we are still lacking on those fronts, and we've not been able to deal with such a situation, yet invoking the Epidemic Diseases Act. In Spain, if you see, all private hospitals have been nationalized in the wake of the pandemic. So that's another great move, giving central powers and keeping in mind the fundamental rights of the citizens. Please do write into us in case if you have a confusion regarding the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897. Further, on the concluding note, I'm gonna talk about what are the penal provisions which are there under the Act on account of which they can be invoked and you can be penalized. The local police can actually book individuals for those who do not comply with the law or regulatory orders related to the curb of the COVID-19. The Section 188 of the IPC is one of those sections which says that violation of any order which has been promulgated by the central government is cognizable, yet it is bailable. Section 269 of the IPC talks about negligently doing any act known or which is likely to spread infection of any disease dangerous to life. Actually, under this section, you can be imprisoned for 6 months or for fine or for both. This section is again cognizable and bailable. Section 270 of the IPC again is one of the acts under which the police can book you. It means malignantly doing any act known to be likely to spread infection of any disease dangerous to life, and the section promulgates a punishment for a period of 2 years or fine or both. And lastly, Section 271 of the IPC, which talks about, knowingly disobeying any quarantine rule, on account of which there is an imprisonment for 6 months or fine or both. So, in the end, I'd like to conclude by saying that though the act is outdated, there is no provision like, as I spoke about, in how there is in Spain, in US, in Australia, where they have some systems in place to deal and protect outbreaks. But yet, this is one of the measures we have. So we must obey the central government. Under the state directive principles and policies, we as citizens also have duties towards our country. So kindly listen to the quarantine and adhere to the quarantine guidelines and be safe. You can write into us on contact@imranaventures.com and we'll answer all your queries there as well. In the end, the last bit of trivia I'd like to post for you is, to be very honest, the Epidemic Diseases Act actually was used to curb the freedom fighter movement in India. Hence, we are not very positive towards the act, but again, it's our savior in the wake of the hour. People like Bal Gangadhar Tilak were actually imprisoned for around 18 months under this act. And, the newspaper Kesari was put as an anti-national paper on the outbreak. And this act was used actually to curb the publications.
Do you have a night routine? Well, everyone has one. And the to-do list usually looks like this. Brush your teeth, set that alarm, get into your pajamas, and switch off those screens. But here's one more to add to that list. Tune into the Positively Unlimited podcast for a dose of positive action and tips on how to build powerful mindsets. Episodes out every Monday on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you tune into podcasts.
How many times have you motivated yourself to improve your sleep, or lose weight, or be more productive? How many times have you failed? Hi, my name is Ashton Doctor. Tune into my show, The Habit Coach Podcast, where we focus on creating small, tiny habits to improve your life instead of those big, impossible tasks. So make listening to me a habit every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcast.com or on your favorite podcasting app.